welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into ancient geography to map out what's arguably one of history's most debated migrations. We've got our hands on two incredibly detailed yet distinctly different source maps that trace this absolute epic of a route. There's a ton of ground to cover, literally, so let's just jump right in. Right off the bat, this brings up a massive puzzle. Can we actually map this journey accurately? For centuries, historians and archaeologists have been racking their brains trying to pin down the exact route. But today, we're not just looking at some dusty old trails. We're looking at how completely different interpretations of ancient texts lead to entirely different lines drawn on our maps. Okay, let's take a look at the big picture. Our first source map gives us this brilliant macro overview of the entire route. If you check out the key over on the left, it numbers the journey from 1 all the way to 12, giving us a really clean progression from Egypt straight through to Canaan. You can see these dotted lines tracing a path through the wilderness, visually breaking down what was essentially a decades-long journey into, well, much more manageable stages. To keep things structured today, we're going to hit 4 main pillars. 1, the starting point at Rameses. 2, crossing the Red Sea. 3, reaching Mount Sinai. And finally 4, entering the Promised Land. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the starting point, Rameses. Now, what's really interesting here is that despite the massive geographical debates we're going to see later on, both of our source maps are in total agreement about the starting line. The black and white map explicitly labels the land of Goshen, right there in the Egyptian delta. And the color map perfectly mirrors this, dropping Rameses firmly in that lush green area where the Nile branches out. So we have solid agreement on step 1. From Rameses, the map data outlines a super specific progression. We move from the start to the very first camp at Sukkoth, which was basically the final stop before the wilderness journey truly kicked in. From there, they push onward to Etham, right on the edge of the wilderness, and finally to Pi-Hahiroth, setting up camp right by the sea. At this point, they're essentially boxed in by the terrain, setting the stage perfectly for our next major milestone. Moving on to Section 2, crossing the Red Sea and the geographical theories behind it. Okay, here's where the geography gets incredibly complex. Putting our sources side by side reveals a massive divergence. The map on the left illustrates the traditional route, drawing a dashed line straight through the central body of water. That's the Gulf of Suez. But the other map? It proposes a completely alternative route, stretching the journey much further east for a crossing at the Straits of Tiran, right at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. It's a huge difference. So we're looking at two very distinct geographical theories. You have the Gulf of Suez route, the traditional path that keeps the journey largely contained within the central Sinai Peninsula, versus the Straits of Tiran route, an alternative path that pushes the crossing entirely out of the central peninsula and way over into the eastern Gulf of Aqaba. Now, we're definitely not picking sides here, we're just observing how vastly different physical terrain shapes our understanding of the exact same text. Zooming in on the annotations for that eastern crossing theory, there's a really fascinating data point: 18. According to the map, the Straits of Tiran crossing is exactly 18 kilometers wide. Plus, it details a natural underwater land bridge sitting right over a shallow coral reef. It's a remarkably specific piece of geographical data used to back up this entire alternative route. That brings us to Section 3, reaching Mount Sinai through the harsh wilderness. Because the water crossing is so heavily debated, the ultimate destination of this leg is totally split too. The first map guides us down to point 10, labeling the traditional site, Mount Musa, deep in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. But if you follow that alternative route across the Gulf of Aqaba, the mountain shifts entirely eastward. It points us over to Mount al-Laz in the ancient land of Midian, which sits in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Just before we move on, you might have caught the word Horeb listed in parentheses next to Mount Sinai on both of our maps. Horeb is just an alternative ancient name used interchangeably for Mount Sinai. So whichever physical peak it actually was, Musa or Al-Luz, both sources absolutely agreed that this is the pivotal location where the 10 Commandments were delivered. So how do mapmakers actually connect these specific peaks and gulfs to the story? Well, take a look at the key in the bottom right corner of our color map. It directly anchors these physical locations to specific ancient texts. Chapters 12 through 17 map the departure and the sea crossing. Chapter 19 anchors us squarely at Mount Sinai. And Numbers 13 and 14 chart that final push towards Canaan. These maps are literally attempting to draw physical lines between ancient written coordinates. And finally, Section 4, the Promised Land, entering Canaan. Look at the final dashed purple line on the map here. After that long, winding red line through the wilderness, the color shifts to purple as the journey turns distinctly northward. This path tracks straight from Kadesh Barnea, moving steadily up into Canaan, marking the ultimate goal of this massive historical migration. If we break down this final leg, we can see two critical steps. Step 1 is the camp at Kadesh Barnea, labeled as Point 11. The map explicitly notes Israel sent spies from here. So it wasn't just a quick rest stop, It was a crucially important strategic staging ground. And then step 2 is Point 12, the final entry into Canaan itself, which brings this epic mapped route to a close. We have covered a massive amount of geography today, navigating everything from natural land bridges to ancient coordinates and shifting mountains. And I think it leaves us with a really provocative thought. How does mapping these ancient narratives fundamentally change our relationship with history? When we take ancient words and force them onto a physical map, it bridges the gap between text and terrain. It turns a distant story into a tangible, physical reality that we can actually debate and analyze. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I'll catch you next time.